"What was your radio name?" Commander Green asked the elderly man at the air show. The old pilot's eyes focused on something far away. "Shadow 4, sir," he whispered. The commander's face went white, his coffee cup slipping from his fingers. "Comment, honor, if you respect the pilots who flew where others couldn't." Thomas Reed shuffled through the crowd at the Naval Air Station open house, his weathered hands gripping a simple wooden cane. At 86 years old, he moved slowly, carefully, his body bearing the accumulated weight of decades. He wore a plain windbreaker over a faded polo shirt, khaki pants that had seen better days, and scuffed sneakers. Nobody gave him a second glance as he made his way toward the vintage aircraft display. He'd driven 3 hours to get here, this small air show at the base where he'd never served but always wanted to visit. The younger crowd pushed past him, eager parents with children on their shoulders, veteran groups in matching caps and jackets covered with patches. Thomas had no patches. He had no veteran cap. He just had memories and a deep need to see the planes one more time before his eyes got too bad to make out their lines. The volunteers at the aircraft display were mostly young sailors, enthusiastic but dismissive of the elderly visitors who slowed down the lines. When Thomas reached the barrier around a restored F-4 Phantom, he stopped and stared, his hand trembling slightly on his cane. "Sir, you need to keep moving," a young petty officer said, not unkindly but firmly. "There are people behind you." Thomas nodded, but his feet wouldn't move. He was looking at that aircraft like it held answers to questions nobody had asked him in 40 years. "Sir," the petty officer repeated a little more insistently now. An older woman behind Thomas sighed loudly. "Some people just don't understand this is for everyone, not just their personal memory lane," she muttered to her husband. Thomas's cheeks colored slightly, and he started to move, but his gaze stayed locked on that Phantom, on the specific angle of the wings, the curve of the canopy. That's when Commander Jason Green walked past on his way to give a demonstration briefing. Green was 45, a decorated naval aviator with 23 years of service, and he was known throughout the fleet for his encyclopedic knowledge of aviation history. He'd flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts and trained dozens of pilots who'd gone on to become legends themselves. But today he was just trying to get through the crowd to reach the briefing stage. He noticed the commotion at the Phantom display, the old man holding up the line, the impatient petty officer. Green almost walked on. He had a schedule to keep, but something made him stop. Maybe it was the way the old man was looking at that aircraft. Not with nostalgia or curiosity, but with the specific analytical gaze of someone who'd known that machine intimately, who'd trusted their life to it. "Is there a problem here?" Commander Green asked, his voice carrying authority. The petty officer straightened. "No, sir, just moving the crowd along. This gentleman was taking a bit too long." Green looked at Thomas properly now, taking in the trembling hands, the fixed stare, the way he stood, despite clearly being in some discomfort. "You flew?" Green asked directly. Thomas turned slowly, surprised to be addressed by someone in uniform who seemed genuinely interested. "Yes, sir. Long time ago." His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much anymore. "Navy?" "Yes, sir." Green studied him more carefully now. There was something about Thomas's posture, the way he held himself despite his age, that spoke of flight training, of countless hours in cockpits. "What did you fly?" The crowd around them had quieted, sensing something shifting in this interaction. Thomas hesitated, his eyes drifting back to the Phantom. F-4s mostly, and some other aircraft. Commander Green felt a tingle of recognition. The way Thomas said other aircraft, with that specific, careful vagueness, the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet Green's when he said it. Green had heard that tone before in classified briefings, from pilots who'd flown missions that didn't exist in official records. "When did you serve?" Green asked, his voice gentler now, but more focused. "Vietnam era, sir. Started in '66. Thomas's hand tightened on his cane. The commander's mind was racing now, connecting dots. Vietnam, F4s, that particular age, that particular careful way of speaking. Did you have a radio name? The question seemed casual, but Green's entire body was tense, waiting for the answer. Around them, the other sailors had stopped trying to move the crowd. Something important was happening, even if they didn't understand what. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he hadn't said in decades. Then he looked directly at Commander Green, and in his faded blue eyes there was a flash of who he used to be. "Shadow 4, sir." Commander Green's face drained of color. His coffee cup, which he'd been holding in his left hand, slipped from his fingers and hit the concrete, splashing across his polished shoes. He didn't notice. He was staring at Thomas Reed like he'd seen a ghost, which in a way, he had. "Shadow 4, Green repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Behind him, his aide, a young lieutenant who'd been checking her phone, looked up sharply. She'd heard that designation before in her advanced tactical training. The petty officer who'd been hurrying Thomas along had gone very still. Even the impatient woman behind Thomas had stopped complaining, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. Green's hand came up, not quite a salute, but close, a gesture of profound respect. "Sir, I need you to come with me, right now." It wasn't a request. Thomas looked confused, almost worried. "I'm not in any trouble, am I?" "No, sir," Green said, and there were tears forming in his eyes. "You're not in any trouble, but I need you to come with me immediately." 20 minutes later, Thomas Reed sat in the base commander's office, still clutching his cane, completely bewildered by the activity swirling around him. Commander Green had made 3 phone calls, each one more urgent than the last. The base commander, a captain with 30 years of service, had been pulled out of another event. 2 intelligence officers with high-level clearances had been summoned, and someone was pulling classified files from archives that Thomas didn't know still existed. "Mr. Reed," Commander Green said, sitting across from him now, his voice shaking slightly. "Do you know what Shadow Squadron was?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I was part of it. We flew deep reconnaissance missions over North Vietnam and Laos. Photographed targets, sometimes marked them for strikes. It was classified work." Green leaned forward. "Sir, Shadow Squadron wasn't just classified. It was one of the most elite reconnaissance units in the entire war. You flew missions that were considered suicide runs. You went into areas with the heaviest SAM concentrations, the densest anti-aircraft fire, with no weapons, no support, just cameras, and your skill. Shadow 4 was the designation for the flight leader of the secondary element." One of the intelligence officers, a commander with silver hair, pulled up something on his laptop and turned it so Thomas could see. It was an old photograph, grainy and faded, of 4 men in flight suits standing in front of an F-4 Phantom. Thomas looked at it and felt 50 years collapse into nothing. "That's me," he said quietly, pointing to the second figure from the left. He looked impossibly young in the photo, his face unlined, his eyes bright with the kind of confidence that came from not yet knowing everything that could go wrong. "Shadow Squadron flew 847 missions over 3 years, the intelligence officer said, reading from his screen. "They gathered intelligence that was critical to some of the most important operations of the war. They had the highest mission success rate and the highest survival rate of any unit doing that kind of work, which is remarkable considering what they were flying into. Of the 16 pilots who served in Shadow Squadron, only 6 are still alive." He looked up at Thomas. "You're one of them, sir." Thomas felt something break open inside him, something he'd kept locked away for decades. After the war, he'd come home to nothing. No parades, no recognition, no job prospects for a pilot with skills he couldn't talk about. He'd worked in a warehouse for 30 years, driving a forklift, never mentioning he'd once flown into hell at 500 knots. He'd married late, had no children, lost his wife to cancer 5 years ago. He lived alone in a small apartment with his memories and his silence. Nobody had ever asked him about his service. Nobody had ever cared. He'd stopped wearing anything that identified him as a veteran because the few times he'd tried, people either ignored him or thanked him with empty words that meant nothing. So he'd made himself invisible. Just another old man taking up space. "I didn't think anyone remembered," Thomas said, his voice cracking. Commander Green reached across the desk and gripped his shoulder. "Sir, we remember. We teach your missions at flight school. We study your tactics. Shadow Squadron is legendary. We just never knew the names of the pilots. The records were sealed." Within hours, everything changed. The base commander personally escorted Thomas to the flight line, where the air show was continuing, but now Green had made arrangements. When they reached the demonstration area, the announcer's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special guest with us today, Mr. Thomas Reed, call sign Shadow 4, flew reconnaissance missions over North Vietnam with one of the most elite squadrons in naval aviation history. Sir, if you would join us." Thomas was helped onto the stage, confused and overwhelmed. The crowd of thousands fell silent. Commander Green took the microphone. This man flew into areas where surface-to-air missiles were so thick they blackened the sky. He flew without weapons, without support, relying only on his skill and his courage. He brought back intelligence that saved American lives. Shadow Squadron's work was so classified that these pilots couldn't even tell their families what they did. They came home to silence, and we failed them by not honoring their service. Green turned to Thomas and saluted, crisp and perfect. On the flight line, every sailor in uniform snapped to attention and saluted. In the crowd, veterans stood and raised their hands to their hearts. Thomas stood there, leaning on his cane, tears streaming down his weathered face, finally seen after 50 years of invisibility. The Navy moved quickly after that day. Thomas was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in a Pentagon ceremony 3 months later, along with the other surviving Shadow Squadron pilots. His missions were partially declassified, enough that his story could be told. A documentary was made about Shadow Squadron, and Thomas was interviewed extensively. He finally got to tell his wife's family, his neighbors, the world, what he'd done, what he'd been part of. But more than the medals or the recognition, what mattered to Thomas was that afternoon on the flight line when Commander Green asked him one simple question and actually listened to the answer. For the first time in 50 years, someone had seen him not as an old man in the way, but as the pilot he'd been, the warrior he'd always been inside even when the world forgot. He started attending more veteran events, wearing a Shadow Squadron patch that the Navy had made for him, helping other forgotten pilots tell their stories. His last years weren't spent in silence anymore. Heroes don't always wear their medals. Sometimes they shuffle through crowds with canes, dismissed by people too busy to look closely. They work quiet jobs, live quiet lives, and carry extraordinary stories in their silence because nobody ever asked the right questions. Thomas Reed spent 50 years invisible, his contributions classified, his sacrifices unrecognized. It took one person, Commander Jason Green, to ask a simple question and listen carefully to the answer. That's all it takes sometimes. A moment of genuine interest, a willingness to see past the surface. Every old veteran has a story, and every story matters. Shadow 4 flew into the darkness so others could see the light, and then he lived in darkness himself until someone finally turned on the light for him. That's what respect looks like. Taking the time to ask, to listen, to honor the service that happened in the shadows. Subscribe to my channel if you believe our veterans deserve to be seen, to be heard, to be honored, regardless of how much time has passed. Share this story to remind others that heroes are all around us, quietly living their lives, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Comment below with Shadow 4 if you promise to take time to listen to a veteran's story. Let's make sure no hero spends their final years invisible.